Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that thinks I'm part of their HOA. My mother used to say that spring always feels like a promise. On that day, it felt more like a challenge, as if something was out there waiting to test me. Little did I know, that challenge would arrive in the form of the self-appointed HOA police, brandishing an absurd $64 fine they claimed I owed, and nearly turning my life inside out with their bullying tactics. The bizarre part? I had never joined any homeowners association, never signed any covenant, nor received any official letter about membership. Our family property was generations old, predating most developments in the area, and there was absolutely no reason why we'd be roped into an HOA. Yet apparently, these folks had other ideas. My name is Travis, and I live on a 4-acre piece of land that has been in my family for over 70 years. To be precise, it used to be my grandfather's small hobby farm. When he passed it down to my father maintained it, though mostly for nostalgic reasons rather than for profit. I grew up out here, spending countless hours in that old barn playing hide-and-seek with my cousins during summer barbecues. My father eventually pursued a career in law enforcement, working his way up through local police forces until he was elected sheriff in our county. He rarely boasted about it. In fact, he actively discouraged me from name-dropping that relationship whenever I found myself in a predicament. He wanted me to stand on my own feet and not rely on the power of his badge. Over the years, I learned to navigate most scrapes without ever bringing his title into the conversation. But that turned out to be exactly what these so-called HOA police banked on: my unassuming approach, my relative youth, and what they assumed was my vulnerability. They never suspected that the silent man in the uniform who drove up to my gate one day was, in fact, my father. Let me rewind to how this all began. It started innocently enough with a piece of bright green paper stuck under a windshield wiper on my old pickup truck. I had driven into the nearby town to pick up a roll of chicken wire and a fresh can of paint for the barn. When I came out of the hardware store, I noticed something flapping in the breeze under my wiper blade. My first thought was that it was a coupon or some advertisement, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was a violation notice. The statement read in bold letters, "You owe $64 for parking in a non-designated area. You have 15 days to comply or face additional penalties." Parking in a non-designated area? I was in a public lot, legally parked in a proper space, and there was no sign anywhere restricting usage to association members or anything like that. I double-checked the painted lines around my truck. I was inside the lines. Completely puzzled, I flipped the paper over to see if I had missed some kind of disclaimer. That's when I read, "In accordance with the code enforcement guidelines of the Whitebridge Oaks Homeowners Association, this fine must be paid in full or a lien will be placed on your property." It even provided instructions on where to mail the payment. I actually let out a little laugh in the parking lot, half expecting a hidden camera pop-up. Our property is nowhere near Whitebridge Oaks. We live adjacent to a separate development, but we were never included in that association's territory. In fact, I was almost sure that Whitebridge Oaks was a brand new development about 10 minutes away, behind a row of tall pines. It was bizarre. I stuffed the notice in my glove compartment and didn't think too hard about it for the rest of the day. That night, however, I got a phone call from a woman with a nasal voice who introduced herself as Pamela, compliance officer for Whitebridge Oaks Homeowners Association. She demanded I pay the $64 fine immediately, threatening further consequences. I explained to her that there must be some mistake because I don't live in Whitebridge Oaks. That's when she tried some bizarre line. "The new expansions in the area mean your property falls under our jurisdiction now, so you are in fact bound by our covenants." I was flabbergasted. She actually insisted that some newly drawn boundary meant that a handful of older properties, my own included, were forcibly annexed into Whitebridge Oaks HOA. According to her, their broadest reading of the Homeowners Association Charter let them declare that the entire area was subject to their rules. I wasn't going to entertain that nonsense for more than a minute. I calmly pointed out that my father had the original property deed and some documents explicitly stating we were not under the governance of any mandatory HOA. Before I could fully articulate my position, she hung up. I thought that was the end of it, or maybe a sign that we'd have to resolve the matter through an attorney. I wasn't that concerned about the $64, but the principle of the thing annoyed me. I didn't want to pay money to an organization with no legitimate claim over me. However, If an attorney had told me to just pay $64 to avoid a headache, maybe I'd have considered it. But something in my gut said that giving in would just invite more trouble. That's how bullies operate. I soon found out just how persistent bullies can be. 2 days after that phone call, I came home to discover a chain strung across my driveway. It was locked with a heavy padlock I didn't recognize. Attached to the chain was another bright piece of paper declaring, "Notice of non-compliance. This property is in violation of Whitebridge Oaks guidelines. Access restricted until compliance is met." I was incensed. I had every right to access my own driveway. Our land is clearly posted as private property, and in the state I live in, that sort of blockade is absolutely illegal unless you have a court order or you're law enforcement with a legitimate warrant. This was a blatant violation of my rights. I was so furious that I nearly hopped out of my truck to break the lock. But I held back. My father raised me to handle situations calmly, to gather evidence first, and to act with reason. So I parked on the shoulder of the road, took pictures of the chain and the notice, and tried calling the phone number from the earlier notice. It went straight to voicemail. I let out a long, exasperated breath, checked the time, and realized it was late afternoon on a Friday, which meant a potential weekend fiasco if I didn't handle it quickly. I decided to contact an attorney friend of mine, an old college roommate named Matt, who specialized in real estate law. While I waited for him to call me back, I yanked my bolt cutters out of the barn's tool chest. I ended up walking around the chain, crossing through the thin wooded area that borders my front property line. Sure enough, I was able to navigate around the blockade to reach my front door. I set my bolt cutters down, checked for any hidden cameras or new signs, then cut the chain off. I locked my gate behind me with my own lock and then left the chain and the bright paper in a neat little pile on the porch as evidence. That should have been the end of it, but things escalated further. By Monday morning, an official-looking SUV arrived with the words, "HOA Compliance and Security," emblazoned on the side. 2 uniformed individuals stepped out, wearing navy blue polos with some embroidered patch that read, "Whitebridge Oaks Enforcement." It looked suspiciously like they had purchased custom uniforms from some online store. They approached my door with the arrogance of an occupying force. When I answered, the older one, a man in his early 50s, introduced himself as Marshall. His partner, a woman in her 40s with a tight bun, said her name was Tessa. Both of them repeated this idea that my property was under the new expansion of Whitebridge Oaks. They told me they'd mailed me an official notice about it a month ago. I told them I never received such notice, and that if they had truly mailed one, it must have gone to the wrong address. Marshall huffed, "That's not our problem. You owe us $64, plus an additional $150 for the chain you cut down," which was association property. My eyebrows shot up. They were essentially trying to fine me for removing their unlawful blockade from my own driveway. Ridiculous. I calmly explained my stance. I am not and never have been a member of Whitebridge Oaks HOA. My property is not part of their development, and I had the original deed to prove it. Tessa smirked at me like she was dealing with a wayward child and repeated the phrase, "Our attorneys have determined that your property is included in the new annexation." I told them that if they wanted to claim annexation, they'd better come back with a court order. Marshall then responded, "Well, if you refuse to comply, we will be forced to escalate this matter. Expect to hear from us again." Before I could retort, they turned and walked back to their SUV. My frustration soared, but again, I tried to keep calm. I was, however, starting to consider that maybe I should mention my father's position, but I knew Dad hated me using his role as a threat, so I continued to let the situation play out, collecting evidence all the while. 3 days went by without incident. I actually started to think that maybe they realized they had no legal standing and decided to drop the matter. It wouldn't be the first time an HOA tried to overextend its power, realized it was out of bounds, and then quietly retreated. But on the 4th day, something absolutely outrageous happened. I had gone into town to pick up supplies to finally fix that porch step. When I returned, I found my driveway blocked again, not by a chain, but by 2 HOA enforcement vehicles parked sideways, effectively barricading the path. Worse yet, a couple of people in neon vests were using heavy machinery to tear down the side of my barn. I panicked. My barn was an old wooden structure that might appear rickety from the outside, but it had so much sentimental value. Inside were tools my grandfather had used, an antique workbench, and a lifetime of memories. I immediately jumped out of my truck and ran up, shouting at them to stop. Tessa was there, barking orders. A man in a bright yellow vest looked confused when I told him to cease work. Tessa told me, "We are demolishing this hazardous structure per HOA guidelines. Your barn is in violation and is an eyesore that drags down property values." The gall of these people nearly left me speechless. They were not only trespassing on my property, they were actively destroying it. I threatened to call the police. Tessa smirked again and said, "Oh, go ahead. We've been in contact with local law enforcement, and they're well aware of our new mandates. They won't help you." That's when I finally dropped the polite facade. I took out my phone, dialed 911, told them about the illegal trespassing and property damage in progress. Then I stepped away to film the scene with my phone camera, capturing every bit of the chaos and ensuring I got Tessa's face, the license plates of the vehicles, and the people hacking away at the barn. 10 minutes later, a local deputy arrived. I recognized him as a relatively new hire in my father's department, though he wasn't personally familiar with me. He got out of his cruiser looking a little uncertain, probably because he saw the HOA enforcement vehicles and assumed it was some official code compliance job. I quickly approached him, explained the entire situation, showed him the original deed, my ID, and the notices that the HOA had left. Tessa started ranting about me owing fines and refusing to abide by the rules, claiming they had official permission from the county. The deputy stepped aside to radio dispatch for clarity, eventually walking back to me to say that the situation sounded civil in nature. He did confirm that no official condemnation order for the barn existed, and there was no valid demolition permit on file. That put him in a tricky position because, as he told me, I can't forcibly remove them unless we prove they're trespassing or committing a crime. I nearly lost my cool. They were physically damaging my property, but the deputy was hesitant, apparently due to confusion over the HOA's claims. Then Tessa said something brazen. "We talked to one of your superiors at the department, and he said to just do what we need to do." That was the last straw. I pulled the deputy aside, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "I need you to call the sheriff directly, right now. Let him know this is Travis on the line. I can't stand by and watch these people demolish my barn." The deputy's expression changed from confusion to caution. Perhaps he suspected that the sheriff and I were related. "Still," I insisted, "please call him. I'm requesting immediate assistance." The deputy nodded and picked up his radio. Within 15 minutes, 2 more cruisers pulled up, and in one of them was my father. He stepped out, his face stoic, but with that hint of anger I'd seen only a handful of times in my life, usually when he dealt with a particularly arrogant suspect who thought they were above the law. Tessa's arrogance seemed to evaporate the moment she realized the man walking up was the county sheriff. Meanwhile, Marshall scurried around behind the barn, trying to avoid eye contact. My father calmly asked me to recount the situation. I did so, pointing out the partially demolished corner of my barn, the heavy machinery parked in my yard, and these so-called HOA enforcement vehicles blocking my driveway. He turned to Tessa and Marshall, who were doing their best to look official. "I need to see your paperwork," he said firmly. They stumbled over their words, claiming they had permission from some local board, referencing a boundary expansion but not producing any valid documents. My father's next question was direct. "Do you have a court order for demolition, a county condemnation notice, a property lien that's gone through the appropriate legal channels?" They had none of it. They tried to wave around a piece of paper stamped with the Whitebridge Oaks letterhead that said covenant violation, but that meant nothing without actual legal backing. My father then turned to the demolition workers who were standing there awkwardly. He asked them if they had a permit for demolition on file with the county. They did not. Apparently, Tessa had told them the HOA was authorized to tear down dangerous abandoned structures, and they believed it. The man in the bright yellow vest confided that they were hired as a subcontractor and were told the job was fully permitted. My father looked at the damage, took in a slow breath, and then quietly asked me, "Do you want them removed from the property?" I nodded. He signaled for one of his deputies to begin the trespassing procedures. Tessa realized how bad the situation was turning, tried to sputter something about, "We were just following the HOA guidelines," but the deputy repeated, "The guidelines do not override state or county law. This is private property." Another deputy stepped forward and asked Tessa and Marshall for their IDs, informing them that a trespassing charge could be issued. That's when Tessa's mouth fell open, and she pointed at me, yelling, "This is your fault. You should have just paid the fine. Now you're going to be sorry." But her threats carried no weight at that point. Within minutes, the sheriff's department escorted Tessa and Marshall off the property, advising them that if they returned without a proper legal reason, they'd be arrested. The demolition workers apologized profusely, saying they had no idea it was an unapproved job. They left, but not before I got the contact information for their boss, just in case I needed a record of who hired them. My father remained on site to document the damage to my barn. He took pictures, measured the area they had knocked down, and prepared a formal police report. The side of the barn was partially gone, leaving a gaping hole that exposed the interior. Some structural beams were cracked or splintered. It was going to be expensive to repair. Despite the anger swirling in my chest, I felt an odd sense of relief that my father was there, ensuring everything was documented. He stayed professional, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He doesn't take kindly to bullies, especially ones that try to hide behind a facade of legitimacy. That night, after everyone left, I stared at my barn under the moonlight. I was devastated by the damage. My grandfather's old workbench was still intact, but the entire corner of the building was compromised. As I walked inside, I discovered the dusty boxes containing memorabilia from decades ago. Some of the frames inside were shattered, presumably from the vibrations of the heavy machinery. My father found me in there, rummaging around for salvageable items. He said quietly, "We'll hold them accountable. Don't worry." I nodded, fighting the urge to lash out in frustration. It was one thing to pay a small fine or squabble over a boundary dispute, but tearing down part of my family's barn was an altogether different level of intrusion. My father was right. We would hold them accountable. The next morning, I reached out to my attorney friend, Matt. He nearly choked on his coffee when I told him about the barn demolition. He asked me to forward all the documents, including the videos and photos. By noon, he was back on the phone with me saying, "They have no legal leg to stand on. File a civil suit for trespassing, destruction of property, and any related damages. Also, send a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA." That was exactly what I intended to do. The following day, I had a lengthy meeting with Matt, and we outlined the game plan. Send a cease and desist to Whitebridge Oaks. Demand full payment for all damages, repairs, and attorney fees, or risk a lawsuit. File a police report with the county, already done by my father, and ensure the district attorney was aware of potential criminal charges for any future trespassing. Investigate the HOA's claim that my property was annexed. Confirm with the County Property Records Office. Later that week, I visited the County Property Records Office to confirm that no recent rezoning or boundary expansions included my property. The clerk there recognized my address immediately and said, "No, your property hasn't changed hands or boundaries in decades. There's definitely no HOA covenant on file." That sealed it. There was absolutely no validity to Whitebridge Oaks' claim. On my way back, I swung by the local hardware store for additional lumber to patch up the barn. It wouldn't be a perfect fix, but at least I could keep out raccoons and stray cats while I geared up for the bigger structural repairs. 2 days later, I got an email from Matt saying Whitebridge Oaks refused to comply with the cease and desist. Instead, they threatened to escalate with the county and place a lien on my property. In the real world, placing a lien on someone's property without a legal judgment is a huge no-no. They were basically bluffing, but we had to treat it seriously. Matt fired back a response, making it crystal clear we would pursue legal damages if they didn't rescind their threats. Then something unexpected happened. I got a phone call from a local investigative journalist. Apparently, word had reached them about an HOA's alleged overreach and demolition fiasco. They wanted to interview me. I hesitated at first, not wanting to turn my life into a spectacle, but then realized that shining a light on this might protect me and others. So I agreed to talk to the reporter under the condition that they not reveal personal details like my father's name. The reporter agreed, and we scheduled a time for them to come out and see the damage for themselves. The day the reporter came, I felt an odd sense of both dread and relief. I was worried about stirring the pot even further, but also relieved that maybe bringing public attention to the matter would deter Whitebridge Oaks from trying more stunts. The reporter asked me to recount the timeline, the bogus $64 ticket, the phone calls, the chain across the driveway, the demolition. They filmed the barn's damaged side, captured how the roof now sagged slightly in that corner. I then explained how my father discovered they had no permits or legal grounds for their actions. The reporter seemed incredulous and asked, "Why would they do all this over $64? I shrugged. "I think it's about power, not the money," I said. "They probably singled me out as the new kid. or they realized I was alone on this property most days and thought they could bully me. The reporter took meticulous notes and photos, promising to run the story as soon as possible. A few days after that, my father told me that Tessa and Marshall had been politely invited down to the sheriff's office for questioning regarding the trespassing and destruction of property. They tried to spin a sob story about how they were just complying with the HOA board's instructions and how they truly believed they had the right to do it. My father informed me that Tessa kept trying to name-drop some local politician who apparently lived in Whitebridge Oaks, claiming he gave them the green light. But, as my father succinctly put it, no politician's off-the-cuff comment overrides the law or grants permission for private demolitions. That was the last I heard from them directly for a while. During the next few weeks, I spent most of my free time fixing up the barn. Friends and neighbors came out to help, donating spare wood or lending me tools. Even one of my father's colleagues, who owned a contracting business, offered me a discount on structural repairs. I felt the warmth of community rallying around me. Meanwhile, Whitebridge Oaks was apparently fielding negative publicity from that reporter's story. I heard rumors that a few prospective buyers in their development backed out, citing the news of HOA harassment. The best part was that all of this was inflicted by their own reckless behavior. If they had just left me alone, they wouldn't have tarnished their reputation so severely. Eventually, Matt filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA board for damages and harassment. We cited the destruction of the barn, trespassing, false claims of annexation, and so on. That's when the board tried to throw Tessa and Marshall under the bus, claiming the board had never authorized that level of force. Tessa and Marshall, in turn, insisted they were acting under direct orders from the board. It was a blame game, each side trying to pin liability on the other. We sat back and watched them tear each other apart in depositions. I provided every single document I had: the phone calls, the phony violation notices, the video footage, the pictures of them blocking my driveway. It was pretty cut and dried that they had no authority to do what they did. As the lawsuit inched forward, the local DA also considered pressing criminal charges for trespassing and destruction of property. My father had turned over the complete police report. The DA was not too keen on ignoring such blatant disregard for property rights. I was prepared to testify in any criminal proceeding if it came to that. The HOA's attorney attempted multiple times to get me to settle quickly. They dangled a modest sum of money that wouldn't even cover half the barn repairs. Each time, Matt said, "Absolutely not. We have the evidence, and we're not bowing down." Meanwhile, the journalist kept following the story. The coverage grew from a local piece into a bigger debate about the overreach of certain HOAs and the complicated nature of how they sometimes abuse limited power. A secondary narrative involving Hugh, a neighboring property owner, a private elderly guy who received strange Whitebridge Oaks notes, emerged. He presented me with a stack of papers demanding he pay for fence repairs in an area he never utilized. He was going to ignore them, but he saw my barn fiasco on the news and asked for guidance. He discovered Whitebridge Oaks had included him in their fictional annexation. He had decades-old proof, like me, that his farm was exempt. We shared our materials with Matt to clearly safeguard Hugh's property in the case. After one legal struggle, Whitebridge Oaks apparently tried to get money from other longtime residents. They may have noticed their finances were fragile and felt they might make money by forcing older houses to pay arbitrary fees. I became more incensed as I learned. Their intimidation had continued for some time, but I was the first to openly protest. Hugh's involvement proved I wasn't alone. Our legal case grew in the weeks that followed. Matt noticed that Whitebridge Oaks was struggling financially owing to overbuilding in their major development area and low HOA returns. That's why they aggressively sought other properties to take over to grow their membership and fees. Yet they never submitted legal expansions or received county approval. They bullied unwitting neighbors. Internal HOA documents revealed in discovery showed a scheme to pressure older property owners with notices and escalate to forced compliance where feasible. The playbook read like a dirty criminal enterprise, not a homeowners association. Tessa and Marshall were indicted for criminal trespassing and property destruction. The demolition supervision film was damning. Tessa said she was following official orders, yet she had no permit or condemnation order. The board tried to differentiate themselves but failed. Public opinion has turned against them. Many HOA residents demanded a leadership change after discovering that the entire Whitebridge Oaks board had planned this catastrophe. A board-wide recall vote was rumored. These liabilities cost the development thousands in legal bills and ruined its reputation. Over months, I reconstructed most of the barn's damaged part. I repaired timbers, mended the roof, and replaced broken siding with help. Though my grandfather's woodworking craft may never be perfectly recreated, I tried my best to approximate the original style. Still, when I stood back and looked at the barn, I felt triumphant, knowing how close I came to losing family heritage to a bully's arrogance. My father often visited to check on me. He always shook his head and said, "They picked the wrong person to mess with." Although we never stated it, we knew that if I had cowered and handed over $64, my difficulties might have multiplied. The HOA could have fined me for whatever they didn't like about my property. They could have micromanaged my paint color and mailbox kind. Only standing my ground made sense. Eventually, the lawsuit settled. The HOA's insurance provider wanted a settlement since they knew they would lose heavily in court. Matt negotiated toughly. Whitebridge Oaks paid for all barn repairs, additional damages for emotional suffering, and attorney fees. The settlement was large enough for me to renovate the farm as I had dreamed for years, not merely fix the barn. They also signed a formal commitment to stop annexing my property or contacting me about HOA matters. They had to admit they had no control over me. I further demanded that any future harassment of me or my property result in swift legal action. They had to cooperate. Hugh too got respite, a nice victory. Whitebridge Oaks apologized and revoked all notices. They reimbursed his legal bills. Hugh told me he was delighted we fought back because he could have paid thousands for fake fence repairs. The relief was immense. The best closure came when Tessa and Marshall were charged with crimes. I was in the courtroom back. I watched Tessa wiggle as the judge questioned her justification for authorizing unpermitted demolition on private land. Marshall sought to transfer blame, but the judge was uncaring. Both received fines and probation. It wasn't a long jail sentence, but it was a criminal conviction and should deter future schemes. The court said, "This is one of the most egregious abuses of supposed HOA power I've seen." Verified, that statement made me smile. After everything settled, I reflected on what I learned. While vital, my father wasn't my main shield. Documenting everything, gathering proof, and refusing to allow bullies beat me were my defense. After the incident crossed the line into criminal area, having the sheriff's badge in my corner hastened the settlement. It's ironic that Tessa first claimed local law enforcement supported them without knowing the sheriff was my father. If they had known it from the outset, they might have left me alone, but arrogance rarely yields to logic. Following the disaster, my homestead is safer than ever. I added motion sensor cameras, updated fence line signage, and identified every access as private property. Neighbors near Whitebridge Oaks have been more vigilant, reporting suspected HOA interference. After the recall elections, the new board seemed to seek to restore the development's reputation by being transparent and fair. I didn't want to join them, but some citizens were seeking to break with the former regime's authoritarianism. I'm sometimes asked if I paid the $64 fine. No, of course. They received no payment. They paid me more in settlement than I expected. I think the real triumph was keeping my family's barn, our history, and establishing that nobody can just go up, take your land, and demolish your stuff under the guise of HOA expansion. I can't believe they thought a $64 fine could lead to forced destruction. They just exposed their malfeasance and spent a fortune on legal bills. Friends, thank you. See you soon.